And so, Grand Pharaoh, Ra Nasser, you've become an instrumental player in the divine rights movement, along with other key leaders among so-called black people worldwide, under the banner of the 37th dynasty of the Pharaonic state of Vyres Aminta, to restore sovereignty to our people. What's the difference in what you're doing in regards to sovereignty, as opposed to the sovereign citizens movement, Washita Moors, Nubians, or other similar pursuers of sovereignty?
There is a fundamental commonality within the sovereignty movement, which is, in the face of tyrannical governments, commonwealths, and or corrupt regimes, people all over the world are claiming their natural, human, and in our case, divine rights. The sovereignty movement in and of itself, as it is commonly referred to in the Americas, is actually a United States white supremacist organized of alleged domestic terrorists referring to themselves as sovereign citizens or as patriots, whom align themselves with the principles embedded in the Declaration of Independence, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government. And these persons certainly have the right to do so, as these ideologies are enshrouded in their Constitution. The problem is that none of the sovereign-based movements derived from the points of reference which validate sovereign citizens' ideology act likewise to validate people of so-called African descent in obtaining the same sovereign rights and privileges. And that's because, just like Prince Hall Freemasons went to European Grand Lodges to establish themselves as legitimate carriers of the craft, when they, the so-called descendants of Africa themselves, were the sole inventors of the craft. And so we see this trend among ourselves in the validation of self, in every single case, a phenomenon of the European trying to be like us, but telling us in order to be who and what we are, we have to be like them who's trying to be like us. And this is a completely absurd idea. But this is exactly what all of the other so-called sovereignty movements are doing. Just like the Prince Hall Freemasons, they are seeking permission to be what they are by modeling themselves after ideologies and concepts which actually only apply to people of the Caucasian background. And the reason being this: 70% of the historically classic legislation that came out of ancient Rome, and by classic I mean unparalleled psychological warfare tactics as a legal maneuver. 70% of the classic legislation that came out of Rome was orientated to the complete destruction and obliteration of the so-called African's true identity, most of which have carried over into the practices of law in our modern day governments. That being the case, I make reference to one such legal maneuver in particular, which was the raising of the constructive trust of Afrikaners, instituted as the name for the entire continent following the conquest of the Roman general Scipio Africanus over Hannibal. There is a lot of debate as to the origin of the word Africanus. Some claiming the word is of Phoenician origin from the word Afer, others claiming other etymological sources for its origin, which we hold to be unrelated, with the exception of wherein it exposes the implementation of Africanus as a constructive trust. A constructive trust is fraud by operation of law. The fraud which was instituted was called, in terms of law, an agnomen, which is a sort of nickname. But even more so, it is a legal fiction introduced into the law, which gave birth to the corporate veils known as ethnic stock, such as Negro, colored, black, Moor, Afro-American, African Americans, and descendants of Africa. Africanus is actually a compound word, Afri, which means beast of the field, beast of the plow, or beast of husbandry. And Canis, which is he who owes a debt from the produce of the land, which is technically the lawful definition of being a slave. What else is a beast of the field who owes a debt from the produce of the land, but a slave? Every year, Congressman John Conyers introduces a bill into Congress for the reparations of slavery. And every year, that bill is shot down. And the reason is due to the language he uses in the bill. When asked, "From whom do you descend?" his response is from Africans who were imported into this country as slaves. And the government's response to that is, "Well, we don't owe you anything." Because a slave in law is property and has no rights. And so slaves were no different than other forms of livestock, of cattle and sheep or goat or horses or what have you. Now, if he were to substitute the word Africanus with the word that lawfully defines us as a nation of people, which is Nichiru, he would receive far more than reparations. However, my point here is anyone claiming a sovereign status who claims descent from the constructive trust territory of Africa or as heirs of Africans has tacitly surrendered all rights and privileges which belong to them under the original state of sovereignty.